mean, I think the first thing is that we as a society need to have a really grown-up, honest conversation about who we want the police to be and what we want the police to do. We got to a point over the last decade where we expect the police to do everything. We expect them to do all of their own job. And as I alluded to before, we expect them to do actually a pretty significant proportion of what used to be other people's jobs, whether that's in terms of mental health care, adult social care, youth services. Repeatedly, police officers have been picking up the pieces that others have left behind, often, to be fair, through no fault of their own. These are the costs and consequences of austerity.
So hi, John. It is lovely to have you back again as a guest on the Blue Light Leavers podcast. And would you believe it, purely by chance, I'd love to say it was planning, but it was really not, but purely by chance, it's a year ago today that your episode actually went live. So incredible
happy
timing.
Anniversary.
Indeed.
Both of us.
Absolutely. And it's proved to be incredibly popular and actually more popular than my own story. So that's disappointing from my perspective, but it's been great. So thank you so much for coming back. I really do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Have you found lockdown? How's it been for you?
There's the $1 million question. I suppose I come at it from all sorts of different angles. How I've found it for myself, how I've found it as a dad of teenagers, how I've found it as a retired police officer, kind of watching on with all that yours and my former colleagues have been faced with. Mm-hmm. For myself, I'll start with that. There have definitely been moments where I've found it tricky. Absolutely, there is an impact on people's mental health, and I think in sort of two different ways. Those like me with pre-existing conditions that lockdown potentially has aggravated, and I think those for whom lockdown itself, COVID itself, has been the trigger for mental ill health. It's really interesting. At the start of last year, so before we'd ever really heard about COVID, I was thinking through my medication that I take. The last 8 years, I've been taking antidepressant medication, and I'm perfectly happy taking it for the rest of my life if I need to. But over the last 4 or 5 years, I'd gradually been lowering the dose, not because I felt any pressure to come off it, but just because actually I was less reliant on it. Mm. And at the start of last year, I got to the point of thinking, well, maybe after 8 and a bit years, when the summer comes round and the sun's out and the weather's good, maybe it's time to try coming off it altogether and just see how I fare. I was already on the lowest dose. And so that was my thought process at the start of last year. But then the pandemic hit, and then lockdown struck. And actually within a very short space of time, I found that I was struggling with my mental health in a way that I'd not done for a number of years. Wow. And rather than come off the meds, I got on the phone to my GP and ended up with a higher dose. So rather than on none of it, I'm on more of it. And I've stayed on that higher dose for the last sort of 12, 14 months. And that's all right.
Yeah,
that's all right. One of the things I've learned over the last 8 years is when you're struggling, the best thing you can do is admit it and ask for help.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And things have settled down a bit for me personally. Yeah. So I'm doing okay. Thanks for asking. And I mean, remarkably, my family are doing okay. But we have 3 teenage girls, and it's placed all sorts of pressures on them, all sorts of burdens on them. I think we all remember, although we're quick to forget, the first lockdown where everything was uncertain and everything was chaos, and schools were scrambling to try and find a way to educate kids from home. And my wife and I were trying to find ways to support and encourage the girls. And, it wasn't easy. But I mean, they've dealt with it remarkably well. But it would be naive for me to think that it's been without consequence for them. And one of the things I think now is sort of, our youngest, I say they're all teenagers. Our youngest turns 13 in about 2 weeks' time. And, with 18 months of lockdown, that's all 18 months of COVID, certainly. That's not far off 10% of her entire life.
Yeah.
You and I are in our 50s. It's a much smaller proportion of our lived existence.
Yeah.
But actually for her and for all of my daughters, it's a big part of their time on earth. And I think as a society and as families, as parents, we'll probably be dealing with the consequences of this for years to come. And I don't think any of us really quite knows what the impact's going to be. So I suppose that's the personal news and the Sutherland family news. Then I suppose we'll come on to the impact on policing, because that's a whole nother ball game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to say that though. My son seemed to cope with it remarkably well, and I'm not sure whether it was because he was sort of engaging with his mates still through the Xbox, when he was probably supposed to be doing schoolwork. But my daughter really struggled, and we really saw a difference, and she was desperate to get back. And she's not a massive fan of school, but it is that interaction. I think it makes such a difference.
Absolutely.
And I know from work colleagues as well that it's been incredibly challenging if you're working full time or whatever, if you've got any sort of work, and particularly obviously those on shifts and things, and then trying to cope with kids at home and trying to teach them and make sure they're being conscientious around their schoolwork as well. It has been incredibly challenging. There's some as we were sort of chatting about before we started, there's some aspects that I've really enjoyed about lockdown, but there's a few things that I really can't wait for a degree of normality again.
Which are the bits that you've enjoyed?
I loved the peace and quiet. I loved no traffic. I loved no airplanes. And I loved, when that first lockdown in particular, when the weather was amazing and totally sort of opposite of how it's been obviously the last few weeks. But, I think we were so fortunate and so lucky with the weather, and nature just exploded. It was almost like we were being rewarded for taking our foot off the gas and just allowing, and just allowing things to be. And I think, I would take calls out walking and stuff like that. It was just lovely being able to, rather than, commuting to and from and stuff like that. It's been lovely to be able to, actually get out and about, and walking every day in nature has become a fixed part of my agenda. Really this morning, this morning I was on a call first thing, and that was all while I'm out and about walking the dog around a local lake and stuff, so that side has been fantastic.
It occurred to me pretty early on. I think I posted something on Twitter to this effect, that for everything else that was going on, the pandemic has at least offered us an opportunity to change. Change some of our lifestyles, change some of our habits, change some of our ways of doing things. The question is, I suppose, whether we're actually going to take that opportunity, or in this rush, this race to get back to normality, we somehow forget some of the things we learned along the way.
Yeah, I hope not. Policing has taken a bit of a hammering. Some of it self-inflicted, but I'll be really interested in your thoughts on obviously what happened during 2020 and from the anniversary of George Floyd, and everything that's gone on. It's been a really challenging year, and what you see as potentially the evolution. I don't know, in your most recent blog you call it the blueprint of policing in 2021. I'd be really interested to know your thoughts around where you can see things going, the impact of what's happened over the past 12 months or so.
Yeah, gosh, $1 million questions, aren't they? I've spent a huge amount of time thinking about those things. And of course, like you, I've still got loads of friends in policing. And I've felt deeply for my other family, the one in blue. You can take the man out of policing, but it's a whole lot harder to take policing out of the man. And I was saying at the start of last year, again, back to the beginning of 2020, I was on record in the media as well as anywhere else, saying, you know, these are the most challenging times for policing in this country since the end of the Second World War. And it wasn't hyperbole. It was just a simple statement of fact. You know, crime was rising, certainly crime of the most serious kinds. But it wasn't just that was going up. Demand was rising too, particularly as a consequence of the huge gaps that had appeared in the delivery of every other frontline public service, you know, the consequences of austerity coming home to roost. So crime was rising and demand was rising, but complexity was rising as well, chiefly as a consequence of technology, both as an enabler of harm and an accelerator of harm. And risk was rising as well, with more police officers, it seemed to me, being more seriously injured than at any previous point in either yours or my lifetime. And so all of these things were on the rise precisely at the point where resources had fallen off a cliff. Again, a fact I've often stated, but the significance of it doesn't diminish. Between 2010 and 18, so in the space of 8 years, the government cut 44,000 officers and staff in England and Wales. And that is just a telephone number. And so at the start of 2020, we were faced with a situation where we had fewer officers and staff with fewer resources doing a job that was more difficult, more demanding, and frequently more dangerous than it had ever been before. And then the virus came, the first wave. And then George Floyd was murdered by an American police officer, and people took to the streets around the world, and certainly around this country. And then the second wave of the virus came, and we were locked down again, and the third lockdown, and then Sarah Everard was murdered, and the protests gathered again. And, you know, policing has been caught right in the eye of the storm. And you're absolutely right. Some of that is of policing's own making. I've never been, and neither are you, a blind apologist for the job we used to do. You know, policing needs to own up to its mistakes, and it needs to not be afraid to say sorry. But it's been really difficult to escape the sense that for much of the time, policing has been damned whatever it's done. You know, I'll give you two particular examples. So example number one would be the policing of the COVID regulations and legislation. You know, given any particular scenario, on the one hand, you'll have voices yelling from the rooftops that police officers are being far too draconian in their application of the powers. And yet, at the same time, from a rooftop across the street, looking at exactly the same circumstances, you'll have people yelling that the police aren't being nearly robust enough. And yet the reality was, of course, that the legislation had been drafted in a hurry. The guidance had been issued in a hurry. We had a government that was leading by soundbite and didn't appear to have any kind of coherent plan. Or if they did, they were making it up as they went along. And police officers were caught in the middle of it all, trying to make sense of it. And they seemed to be damned either way. Take the protests of last summer. And I'm very happy to talk specifically about George Floyd in a moment, if you want to.
Yeah, of course.
But in the aftermath of his killing, there were two successive weeks in London, two successive weekends in London. And on the first, there were the marches called by members of the Black Lives Matter movement, the overwhelming majority of whom were peaceful and law-abiding. But there were a minority that day who used the demonstration as an excuse to attack the police. People claiming anti-racism as their cause, attacking the police. The following weekend, on exactly the same London streets, there was a counter-demonstration, and police officers found themselves being attacked by actual racists. And once again, there was that sense that police officers were being damned whatever they did. I don't think we should ever shy away from what's difficult about policing. But my concern has always been, certainly for as long as I've been kind of writing about policing and sort of commenting publicly about policing, my concern has always been the complete lack of balance in the story being told.
Absolutely.
Because for every negative story, and as I've said, we mustn't shy away from those, I could tell you 100 stories of kind of humanity and heroism that would take your breath away. And then when I was done with those, I could tell you 100 more. And so much of the reason, therefore, for what I do is just to try to make those stories known, to make those voices heard. Yes, let's talk about what's difficult for policing, but let's never stop talking about what's extraordinary for policing, and particularly about the extraordinary women and men who do the job.
Absolutely. And obviously we had the murder of Matt Ratana as well, didn't we? And that impacted, it was such a shock for all of us that something like that could actually occur. It was so tragic.
Yeah. I mean, it's a gut punch, isn't it? It's a family thing. There's a lyric in a song that I love. There's actually about soldiers who lose their lives, but the principle, I think, applies exactly the same to police officers. The line in the song goes, "Each one lost is everyone's loss." And of course, Matt's loss is felt most intensely by those who knew him best and loved him most. But I think it's felt by all of us to a very significant degree. I didn't ever have the privilege of knowing Matt personally, but I know a lot of people who did. Lots of my friends were his friends, and it's impossible to escape the sense that he was a genuinely extraordinary bloke, a larger than life character who loved his rugby, who loved his job, who loved the people around him, and who left his mark in the most positive way on everyone who encountered him. And I remember, gosh, at any other point in history, as we did with Keith Palmer and as we've done for everyone else before them, we would have lined the streets in our thousands as he made his last journey, and we would have paid our respects. And of course, COVID meant that we weren't able to do that. And so I sat in my kitchen watching a live feed of the funeral service on my laptop. And I listened to the commissioner's voice crack as she paid tribute to him. And then watched as Zinzan Brooke, one of the greatest of all the All Blacks, joined a small handful of his friends outside the crematorium and performed a haka. And goodness me, it was powerful stuff.
Yeah, it really was. That was absolutely staggering.
But what a loss. What a loss.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been an incredibly tough period now. Obviously you and I, you sort of look back on things that you've been involved in, but it feels to me as though probably the last 12 months or so, I'm not sure how I would have coped, truth be told. I think I would have found it very, very difficult if I was in the job. And, looking in is slightly different, but like you say, we're still part of the family. How do you think things will evolve? How do you see things progressing from now in terms of policing and what needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we ought to do is just pay tribute again to the folk who are out there actually doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, goodness me, it's a whole lot easier talking about policing than it is doing policing. And, I had my breakdown 8 years ago. The job was challenging enough then and was in part what broke me. It seems to me to be significantly more so now.
Yeah,
I think a number of things need to happen, and they need to happen very urgently. I think the first thing is that we as a society need to have a really grown-up, honest conversation about who we want the police to be and what we want the police to do. We got to a point over the last decade where we expect the police to do everything. We expect them to do all of their own job. And as I alluded to before, we expect them to do actually a pretty significant proportion of what used to be other people's jobs, whether that's in terms of mental health care, adult social care, youth services. You know, repeatedly, police officers have been picking up the pieces that others have left behind, often, to be fair, through no fault of their own. You know, these are the costs and consequences of austerity, which have always been greatest for those least able to bear them. So we need to, I'm not talking here about having a royal commission. That would take too long and cost too much and be unduly bureaucratic, I suspect. But nonetheless, we do need to have that grown-up conversation. What do we want the police to be? You know, are we going to regard them purely in terms of their law enforcement role? Or do we still embrace their much wider responsibilities in terms of community safety? And for what it's worth, I'm for the latter. But at the moment, we're not having that conversation. And until we decide what we want them to be, it's very difficult to determine what we want them to do, because it's not enough to keep turning around and saying we want them to do everything, because everything can't be a priority. Because if everything's a priority, then nothing is. So we need to decide who we want them to be. We need to decide what we want them to do. And then we need to make sure that we properly invest in policing to the extent that it is able to succeed at what we're asking it to be and do. Because at the moment, we're doing none of those things. Policing is grossly underfunded for the role that society is asking and expecting it to perform. You know, I've alluded to the cuts already. I mean, billions of pounds have been taken out. Tens of thousands of people have been taken out. But there's been no reduction in the workload. There's been no reduction in the level of expectation. There is an urgent need to reinvest in frontline policing, operational policing of every kind, but particularly neighborhood policing, which, though it might be the less sexy bit of the job, for want of a better word, it is in many ways the most important bit of the job.
Without a doubt.
You know, local communities are where everything that is good about policing happens. And then I think there are some other things that we need to do. We need to get the politics out of policing. We urgently need the people in charge, chief constables and others, to reassert their operational independence from political control. We've seen over the last decade the enormous damage done when policing gets too close to politics, where decisions are being taken by politicians and their advisors who, frankly, haven't got a clue what they're doing. They don't understand what they're dealing with. They don't understand what they're talking about. I mean, it is extraordinary to me that almost every single one of the so-called reforms of the Theresa May era, both her time as Home Secretary and as Prime Minister, I mean, almost every single one of those reforms has failed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in many cases is actively needing to be reversed.
Yeah.
So the recent discussion about changes to police bail is an obvious example of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the very reversal of the cuts themselves is perhaps the most obvious. You know, you have politicians running around now furiously trying to re-recruit police officers.
Yeah.
Desperately trying to make up for the harm done by their predecessors. So we need to get the politics out of policing. We need to reassert operational independence from political control. And there's loads more that ought to be done, but I don't want to bang on forever. So maybe I'll just stick to one more thing, which is that, and I've alluded to this already, we need to change the conversation that we're having about policing in society. We need to change the way that we regard the men and women who stand on that thinnest of blue lines. because at the moment the conversation is almost relentlessly negative.
Yeah.
The police are racist, the police are corrupt, the police are incompetent, the police are resistant to change, the police are this, the police are that. And it comes from some politicians, it comes from significant sections of the media, and it comes from 1,000 and 1,000 more armchair critics in possession of nothing more than a keyboard and an ill-informed opinion. And it's incredibly wearing. And if it's wearing for you and me as retired officers standing on the sidelines, how much more wearing is it for those who are actually just doing their level best to make a difference in people's lives? So there you go. I don't know how coherent or well articulated that is, but that's a handful of the things that I think need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I know I said it in the last episode as well. And what I love about what you do and how you write, and you know, your blog posts, you do offer the alternative. You know, you tell it as it is, and I think that's so important to give that. You know, the narrative that you talk about. It's so important to do that. But it's funny, you know, despite all of that. You know, all the sort of negative stuff that we've spoken about and all the tough times and everything, you know, it's a job like no other. And, you know, I was very, very fortunate. And, you know, I know you were similar as well. I loved my time in the job. It was, you know, I had such a great time. And there was the odd occasion when I thought, you know, what am I doing to myself? Why am I putting myself through that? But, you know, I've been out of policing for 6 years and in different roles. And I still think that now occasionally, you know, what am I doing? What am I doing to myself? That it is a job like no other. And, you know, that adrenaline rush sometimes, and, you know, that can be so addictive. And it is truly a vocation. There is something in you that when it grabs you, it's really difficult to get rid of. So, you know, I have the utmost respect for anyone that's in the job at the moment. I can't imagine how tough it's been, but I can also understand why people find it so difficult to move on and do other things.
I unequivocally agree with everything you're saying. I still think that it's the best job in the world. I still think it's the single finest thing that any one of us could ever do with our working lives. And I think that, in spite of what happened to me on a personal level, my breakdown and everything that followed. And I think that in spite of everything going on in and around policing at this moment in time, I still think it's the best job in the world. I did an interview with Radio 4 3 or 4 months ago now, probably. But it was all about just how challenging it is for policing at the moment. It was all about, you know, kind of policing in the eye of the storm. And one of the questions that the journalist asked me is, what advice would you give to people who are thinking about joining the police now, wondering whether it's the right thing for them? And I said to him, well, probably the best way to answer that question is what would I do or say if one of my own daughters approached me and said that they were thinking of becoming a police officer? And the answer is, and I know not everybody would agree with me, not everybody in the job or ex-job would agree with me. But if one of my daughters came up to me and said, Dad, I'm thinking about joining the police, I would be the proudest dad in the world. I would be utterly delighted, and I would encourage them with everything that I had. I mean, I'd try and pass on some of what I'd learned along the way. I'd certainly pass on the mistakes that I'd made. But I'd be a very proud dad.
Yeah. Yeah. And likewise, you know, my wife and I, Claire, you know, we've spoken about this as well, if I were the kids. And, you know, my daughter in particular loves sort of anything cop related, you know, and you sort of think, oh, this is only, you know, it's probably only going to go one way. But it's really interesting. My dad was a cop in one of the, you know, county forces. And he joined late 60s. And obviously I joined mid 80s. And I remember him saying to me, you know, as I was growing up, oh, you don't do it. But he was so proud when I joined, so proud. And it was just such a lovely thing, you know, and I think I'd do exactly the same. You sort of be a little bit reticent, but be incredibly proud of the fact that that's the direction that they want to go in. And whether it's for 5 years or for 30 years or 35 years plus, whatever it is, you know, so it's just an incredible thing to actually do your time and genuinely serve. You know, there's no job like it, and the opportunities it offers are fantastic. But I do understand that for many people it's tough, and you know, you can understand why people look elsewhere and think, actually, I've had a gut through this now. You know, through everything that we've just covered. You know, it's such a tough time for people at the moment. So, now you've got some really exciting projects coming up at the moment, haven't you? And are you able to elaborate on what you've been up to?
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? I'm still living life pretty quietly and gently, out of both choice and necessity. But the paperback version of Crossing the Line, my second book, came out last week, and that's got an extra chapter in it talking about policing in 2020. So talking about COVID, talking about George Floyd, talking about Matt Ratana. So that was last week. But the latest thing is that I have just been offered a book deal for my first work of fiction.
That's incredible.
Which sounds absolutely surreal to say that out loud. And I described myself to someone last week as the accidental writer. This had never been part of any plan I'd ever had. You know, I wrote my first book, Blue, in part as therapy. It was part of my mending process after I got sick. And I wrote the second book, Crossing the Line, because I felt there were some things that I still wanted to say. But what I've discovered is that I genuinely love writing. I genuinely love storytelling. And I'd had this tale in the back of my mind, probably for 4 or 5 years, just the outline of it. But it had never sat anywhere other than the back of my mind. I'd never written anything down. But it became this sort of itch I needed to scratch. And I started writing, and it's going to be published next summer by Orion Fiction. It's called The Siege.
Amazing. Are you able to give us anything, or is that it? That's
all
you can tell us at the moment.
I'm sure I can tell you plenty. So people tell you to write about what you know. And I always remember I've got a brilliant book agent, who is constantly giving me bits of advice, all of which is invaluable. But I think the best bit of advice, or the one that I most often return to, she said to me, write the book that only you can write. So this is not a story about a murder detective, partly because I never was one, although I worked with plenty, partly because there are already enough of those in the world of crime writing, and I'm not about to try and compete with Peter James and Ian Rankin and all of the other giants of the genre. So this is a story about a hostage negotiator, because I was one of those. And it's a part of my career that I loved and that I considered to be an absolute privilege. So it's the story, as the title of the book suggests, it's the story of a siege, told in real time, and focuses on 3 primary characters. There's a much broader supporting cast, but it focuses on the main hostage negotiator, the main hostage, and the hostage taker. And it's the story of the 3 of them and how it unfolds over the course of a night.
Wow. Oh, that sounds so good. That's got TV series. That's written all over it. Amazing.
Well, one step at a time. I need to finish writing it first.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. That is so cool. Absolutely stunning.
Thank you.
But as always, it's just so lovely catching up with you, John. I really do appreciate your time and a lovely conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me back.
Not at all. If people want to get hold of Blue and Crossing the Line and obviously connect with you, what's the best way of doing that?
You're kind to ask. So the books are available from all good retailers. And by all means, particularly at this moment in time, support your local bookshops, your local booksellers. like so many people, they've been struggling, but they do a wonderful job. And there's something very special about walking into a real bookshop and picking up a real book. So you can get either book from any of them. And if people want to keep up with me, the best place probably is Twitter, where I remain at Police Commander.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, John. Really appreciate it. Great talking with you.
Well, see you this time next year.
Yes, same day.
Yes, exactly.
It's in the diary. Thanks, John.
Cheers.
I really hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. It really was an absolute pleasure speaking to John. So don't forget you can join the Blue Light Leavers Facebook group at www.facebook.com/groups/Blue Light Leavers. And you can also visit the website bluelightlevers.com. Look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye-bye for now.